And I want to make clear to my listeners that nationalism and the Orthodox doctrinal tradition are not in opposition. When you say that there is a national church body in Ukraine or Serbia or Greece, all you're saying is that the single universal canonical tradition of the Orthodox world is enculturated into a specific area. In the Ukrainian case, the universal canonical tradition of the church is enculturated within the Ukrainian point of view. Ukrainian traditions, Ukrainian saints, the Cossack movement, the Ukrainian language, Ukrainian agrarianism and social ideals, and her history. None of that alters the universal canonical tradition of the church. It's just that it gives it a cultural background within which to work. So an Orthodox nationalist point of view is perfectly orthodox. It simply says that there is one canonical tradition manifest in different traditions, linguistic groups, and historical groups, whether it be from Bulgaria or Greece or the Middle East or Ukraine or Russia. So I want to make it clear that it is one Orthodox church manifest identically within differing historical and cultural circumstances, defined by language, ethnicity, and tradition. That's how the Orthodox Church has been traditionally organized, and as a result, the Orthodox liturgy is done in Bulgarian in Bulgaria, in Greek in Greece, in English in America, in Ukrainian in Ukraine. And it's something that's always been a point of pride in the Orthodox world, is that in our ethnic organization we can reach the common population in his own language, within his own tradition, within his own cultural context. But speaking of which, I want to talk about something. I read an article not too long ago on a topic that, quite frankly, needs to be talked about. He's talking about one of my favorite poets, Ivan Franko. Ivan Franko is a social nationalist, poet and essayist in the late 19th, early 20th century Ukraine. He is one of the most popular poets in Ukraine, and to a great extent manifests the good things both in nationalism as well as in socialism. And he has a vision of literary creativity, poetry, film, writing, even political activism. And I want to talk about that today. And Ivan Franko really kind of fits into everything we've been talking about. He is an absolutely central figure, not just in Ukrainian life, but in the mentality of social nationalism. Franko was not particularly a Christian man. I think he respected the church to the extent that it was Ukrainian and national, but was probably not a believer himself. But his vision of literary creativity should be taken seriously. The first point is that Franko holds that anything that the poet does, that the writer does, has to derive from the folk culture of the people. It cannot exist apart from that. So for a Ukrainian, it has to be the poetic mind has to synthesize the ideas and the experiences and the mentality of the Ukrainian farmer under foreign occupation, under oppression. That the nation and the people are the center of all the work that you do. But this is something very common in the Ukrainian mind, that the national collective is central. If you're a poet or a writer or a TV producer or a banker, nothing that you do will have any moral value unless it derives from the life of the people. But the life of the people is inconceivable without a cultural matrix. And that cultural matrix for the Ukrainian world is the agrarian life, the Orthodox life, the life of the extended family, and the individualist tradition of at least Western and Central Ukraine. That's something of immense importance. And when I say individualist, I'm not talking about that in the Western sense. I'm just talking about a way of economic organization that stressed the family over the commune that you would find in Russia. There was communal landholding in Ukraine, but it was far looser than it was in Russia. So we're talking about the family as opposed to the Russian commune. Both are equally valuable, but it really depends on the nature of economic and the circumstances of the climate, really, in dealing with the two countries. But literature, Franko defines literature as something very broad. It's any artifact that the people create. So it would include painting and writing and politics, so long as it's actually a popular politics, and economics and farming and everything else. All of this can be treated in literary form. In fact, all of this is literary in the very fact of its production and its maintenance. Because while we have very obvious economic needs that need to be maintained, different nations will fulfill these needs in very different ways. That any poet, any real person who is trying to reach the common folk, that these people need to be aware of the traditions, of the opinions, of the religion of the common people that they're trying to reach. The poet cannot be a stranger of society. The poet has to be within society, has to be saturated with that society. There is no objectivity. There is no such thing. There is no place to stand outside of the cultural milieu of the people who you identify with. There is no such thing. This is the problem of sociology. Sociology has to be connected. Political theory has to be connected to a specific living group of people with their own historical memory and music and literature and everything that makes them distinct. For Ivan Franko, poetry is manifesting. And here's a religious idea that comes up in Franko's work, that it manifests the reality of the divine embedded and immanent in the day-to-day life of the common people. This is a huge and profound point. I want to make it clear that the Ukrainian Orthodox vision does not view God as this entity that lives up in the sky somewhere, floating around like the sun. That's false theology. That's baby theology. What we're really talking about here is the logos, or the word, or the connection, the metaphysical, the connection, the energy that holds the created world together. This is the manifestation of Christ in nature. He is the author of natural law. In talking about scientific regularity, we are talking about the manifestation of the Logos of Jesus Christ in created things. He is not created things, but he is manifest in created things. But that's what poetry does. That's what nationalism is. It sees the hand of God in the day-to-day creations of the common folk, because the nation shows the people, the folk, constantly connected in every way. This eliminates classes and hierarchy. We're talking about Ukrainians as Ukrainians, Irishmen as Irishmen. We're not talking about classes. And I know on this program I talked about the notion of estates in medieval political thought. And that's perfectly legitimate within a national idea, but it has to understand that these estates have no power over anybody else. That these functions in society, embedded within a certain national ideal, these don't have power over anybody else outside of their particular area of expertise. And that's really where nationalism differs from the older medieval point of view. We're not necessarily talking about hierarchy, we're talking about a functional, or actually a functionally based equality, or a complex equality. But the idea of poetry is to see the nature of these connections, how God and the energies of God manifest in natural law, and the connection within all things. I call them ecosystems today, but the connection between all things and among all of things, this is God's presence. And it cannot be explained or understood in any other way. Science might talk about their external connection, and that's perfectly legitimate. But their internal energy is something else. And where this internal energy comes from is another matter altogether. Poetry is all about these connections. But these connections never exist in isolation. These connections exist as a part of the ethnic, historical people, the folk. Poetry, according to Franko, is prayer. It's one and the same thing. It takes, from what we've been talking about, it takes the person from their mundane day-to-day life and expresses within these connections the higher life, the basis of all of these connections. It lifts you up from the world of power, the world of cause and effect. It bridges time and space. It must. Any national or ethnic group has to bridge time and space, because the very fact that you are a part of an ethnic group or that you identify with an ethnic group means that you are in immediate connection and communion with people from generations ago that helped create the mentality and the ideas of the ethnic connection. The people who suffered to create independence, the people who suffered to maintain the people as they suffered under foreign occupation or economic exploitation or whatever. So in the process of all of this idea of poetry as prayer, poetry then is a method of mobilization and, as a result, liberation. And remember, we talk about poetry and literature, we're talking about something substantial, far more than just words on a page. We're talking about the manifestation of how people live their lives. We're talking about the agrarian world, the closeness with nature and natural forms. All of this within the ethnic identity that humanizes all of these connections. But in terms of literature, we're talking about everything: politics and economics, economic organization, essays, journalism, poetry itself. Any artifact that comes from the folk it can be classed as something poetic, something literary. And it's a pretty radical point of view, particularly in the late 19th century. It was a fairly radical view. It was a romantic view that there's a connection between the people and the land, and that was mediated by the idea of the logos and the ethnic connections among and within peoples. For Franko, he was a socialist. He did believe in the basic economic equality of peoples, but he also rejected the idea of socialism as a centralized political movement. Socialism becomes a great evil when it's centralized. And this is something, we'll deal with this some other time, but even during the Soviet era, Ukrainian political activists like Hunchar and Shelest and these other people, they wanted to see a USSR decentralized, nationalized into its component peoples and religions and communities, which of course was rejected by Moscow. But the Ukrainian idea is that socialism is to be national, is to be agrarian, is to be decentralized. It's never to be a means of controlling people. It's a way of empowering people, of empowering the ethnos, of empowering the commune, the extended family, the farming family, to take their own economic production and their own world into their own hands. That's really the concept of the Ukrainian socialism, and you see it in Ireland as well, to a great extent. And so you have people like Franko saying that the Russian Bolshevik movement and the social democratic movement is the greatest evil of all time. So you have a real social nationalist like Franko saying that the Russian Bolsheviks and the Russian social democrats and the Russian revolutionaries are the greatest evil, because they're going to now show us the worst of all worlds. They're going to attempt to impose some kind of equality solely from a single center, Moscow. So now you have party control, you have bureaucratic control, and worst of all of this control is done in a ethnic vacuum. Nobody exists but the bureaucracy. So what really happens is that when all's said and done, the idea of Ivan Franko's concept of literary creativity is ultimately that the individual, the family, the farmstead, this is the atom of the Ukrainian national organism. This is that which needs to be empowered to be able to fight back in one way or another against the global economy, And as we talked about in previous shows, here, we've dealt with these questions of Ukrainian economic mismanagement and the oppression of the population, inflation, the rule of the bankers, the rule of these capitalist vultures and vampires who live not by production, not through productive enterprise, but by manipulating the labor of others. So, for people like Ivan Franko, ultimately the ideal political organization is national anarchism, is the idea of national communitarianism and national populism. This is the essence of the social nationalist ideal. We're rejecting centralization. We're empowering communities and local farmers to be able to fight back against the global economic order. And that's what nationalism is all about. And that's what Franko is talking about. And this is the ideal not merely of Ukraine, but of all ethnic nationalist thinking, is the empowerment of the folk, the empowerment of local communities and farmsteads. Not the manipulation of their produce, not the creation of artificial needs and everything that comes out of the modern Western point of view. And now Ukrainian television, which is controlled almost exclusively by Jews in Ukraine now, and oligarchs, is saturated, absolutely saturated with commercials and Western pornography and Western entertainments and everything else. Warner Brothers has almost totally taken over their television. And that's what's going on right now. And so we're talking about a revolutionary approach. We're talking about the understanding of what God is and where He can be found within the Orthodox idea. He is immanent in His creation. He is not that creation, but His energy and His power is to be manifest and is manifest in that creation. And from that comes natural law. And understanding that in its ethnic and religious context is central to understanding what a people is and what makes a people distinct and significant. That's Ivan Franko's view, and to a great extent that's also my view.